Hello everyone, this is Dr. Golding, and we're going to continue our ethics class today with a lecture on Plato's theory of virtue and especially his theory of justice. We're going to talk about Plato's view regarding a just society or a just community, a virtuous community, as well as Plato's view about what it means for an individual human being to have virtue and to have justice. And ultimately, we're going to talk about how Plato tries to answer the argument of the ring. Okay, if you remember, we talked about the so-called ring argument. That was the argument that Glaucon gave to try to show that the only reason people behave justly is because of consequences. No one really wants to be just for its own sake. And so Socrates, and again, I keep flipping from Socrates to Plato, Plato to Socrates, because of course Plato is the author of the text that we're reading, but Socrates is the major character in the dialogue who essentially represents Plato's own views as well. So again, after giving his theory of justice, or his theory of virtue, which we're going to go through in some detail, Socrates tries to explain, based on his theory, why everyone should really want to be just for its own sake and not merely for the sake of its consequences. Okay, so a lot of what I'm going to say today is not actually in the selection because the selection is very abbreviated. So if you're the kind of student who likes to take notes, today is a very good day to take notes. I'm going to go a little slowly today. Of course, this is a video, so if you find that my pace is too slow, you can just put it on a higher speed, I think. But I'm going to go through very slowly and carefully Plato's theory of what it means for a society as a whole to be virtuous, and in particular to be just. And then we're going to turn to what it means, according to Socrates, to what it means for an individual human being to be virtuous and just. Okay, so the motivation for this turning to the issue of, let's talk about a society first. In the Republic, from which your selection is taken, in his classic book called The Republic, Plato outlines what it is for there to be an ideal state. And so we get a little bit here into what's called political philosophy. Now, of course, ethics is the branch of philosophy that deals with what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong. Where does morality come from? Why should we be moral? Why should we be just? That's ethics in a nutshell. Now, political philosophy is the branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of government or the nature of a society, what it would mean for a society to be the best possible society. One of the central questions in political philosophy is, what is the best way to organize a state or a country into a system so that the system overall is just and virtuous? And Plato claims that we need to understand first what it means for a society to be virtuous and just before we can then look at the individual and say, what does it mean for an individual to be virtuous and just? And what he actually says is that, you know, a society is a lot bigger than just one individual, right? A society is made up of many, many, many individuals, perhaps hundreds or thousands, depending upon how big your society is. So he says that sometimes you're able to understand things when they're on a larger scale better than when they're on a more minute scale. So since the society is bigger than an individual, we're first going to look at what it means for a society to be virtuous. What's the best way to organize a society or a city or a state, if you will. Okay, now in the ancient times, and still in some places today, you could have a city that is actually a state unto itself. So sometimes I'll speak a little bit about what does it mean for a city to be just, or a city state. During the time of Socrates and Plato, Athens, the great city of Athens, was itself not just a city, but it was actually a country unto itself, its own state. So what's the best way to organize a state, a city that is a unit unto itself? Okay, so one of the things that Plato sort of lays down, he claims, is that in an ideal city, what's going to happen is you're going to have everybody in that society is going to be doing the task or the job that they are best suited to do. Okay, this makes a lot of sense, right? In a society, it makes sense that ultimately it would be ideal, right? It doesn't always work out this way, but in the ideal situation, every individual in a given state or society would be doing the task that they are best at doing that they are best at doing, right? So if my skill happens to be being a farmer, then in the ideal situation, I'd end up being a farmer or a doctor or a teacher or whatever the case may be. So rule number one in the ideal city is that each individual citizen should be doing the task that is best suited for him or her to do. Keep that in mind. Now, another thing about an ideal society is we have what is sometimes called the division of labor. All right, the term the division of labor, I don't think you'll find that in Plato, but the idea of the division of labor is, you probably are familiar with this. We talked about it in elementary school or high school. The idea of the division of labor is that in a given society, it doesn't make sense if each and every individual is going to be doing, let's say, all the possible tasks that a human being needs. So for example, imagine if you had to be your own dentist, your own doctor, your own farmer, your own butcher, your own lawyer, teacher. If you had to do all those tasks for yourself, it wouldn't be a very efficient system, right? You might not be very good at some of those things, whereas other people are. And on the other hand, as well, if you're trying to do all those things together, there's just not enough time in the day to be doing all those things, right? So it makes sense to what's called, to do what's called make a division of labor, that you're going to have different people doing different tasks, which they specialize at. So a doctor doesn't only perform the task of doctoring on himself and his own family. The doctor is going to be the doctor for the community, for anybody and everybody who needs doctoring. He or she is going to be the doctor for those people. And then other people are going to be farmers. Again, the case of a farmer, he's going to farm or she's going to farm, not just for himself or herself, but they're going to farm for everybody. And then they are going to trade or sell or barter their services for other people's services. Okay, and eventually you might have a system where there's money, right? So you can sell your services as a doctor for money. Then you take that money and then you can go to the store and buy food. You can go to another store and, buy your electronics, and you don't have to be your own mechanic, your own doctor, your own farmer, your own lawyer. You just have to pick one profession that you specialize at, and hopefully, like we said before, it's going to be the profession or the skill that you're best at, right? And that way the society as a whole is going to be better off. So far we have two basic principles. They're related. One is that each person should ideally get to do the task that they are best at. And the second is the division of labor, that there should be specializations, that each person does basically one thing that they're very good at, and they trade or barter their services or the goods that they've produced for other goods and services that other members of the society produce or provide, okay? So far, I hope this makes sense. Now, the next step is a big step, It is, Plato claims that in the ideal city, there's going to be basically three major groups, okay? Three major segments of society. And this is sometimes called the tripartite division of the state or the city. The tripartite division, okay? Just the word tripartite simply means breaking something up into three parts, the tripartite division of the city. In the ideal city, there's going to be three parts. Now, what are those three parts going to be? Very important now, okay? Basically, Plato lays out a scheme where you're going to have, first of all, what's called the laborers. All right, hope you can see this. The laborers. Now, the laborers are, of course, people who work. Most people in the society are going to be laborers. By the word labor, don't take it necessarily to mean hard, like back-breaking labor, but any individual who is involved in producing some kind of good or service, farmer, lawyer, doctor, they would count as workers. Society has to have people who, produce the goods and services that people need in order to live, right? So in any good society, you're going to have a group of people that are laborers, okay? And that is actually going to be the largest group within the society, the group of laborers, okay? And then you're going to have a second group, which we can call, or Plato sometimes calls them the guardians, or sometimes he uses the phrase the guardian class. But we'll just say the guardians. Who are the guardians? The guardians don't really produce any good or service, as do the laborers do. Rather, the guardians are protecting the laborers. They're protecting themselves also. They're protecting the city. They're protecting the city from outside enemies and also protecting the laborers from one another. Okay, so for example, today we might speak of the army and the police. Okay, the army is the group that's supposed to help prevent attacks or defend the city or the state, the country, from external attacks. And the police would be the people who protect the laborers from one another. Okay, help defend the laborers from one another should someone turn violent or attack their fellow laborers. So you have to have these two classes, so far two classes, the laborers and then the guardians. Now, ideally, the number of guardians should be less in number than the laborers, right? It would be weird if you had more police and more people in the army than actually were working, doing their normal everyday activities, okay? So this is what Plato thinks, is that the class of guardians is actually going to be smaller, but in a way more powerful than the laborers, because the guardians need to have the weapons, they need to have the training to engage in military action and to engage in protecting people from their fellow laborer. So the guardians is going to be a smaller number of people than the laborers, but the guardians are actually going to be, in a way, more powerful than the laborers, okay? And then there's the third class, and you notice how, obviously, I'm drawing or writing these terms up on the board on purpose, with the laborers on the bottom, the guardians in the middle, and then we have the rulers, okay? Okay, the rulers are people who, they don't walk around with guns, they don't necessarily know how to shoot bows and arrows or rifles or whatever it is, but the people who are the rulers are the people who are running the country or running the state, running the city, if that's what it is. Okay, so the rulers are people who are controlling, running, making decisions, making up laws, deciding whether or not to go to war with a given country, deciding what kinds of laws to have, what kinds of policies to have. Do we need a tax? Do we not need a tax? That's what the rulers are supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be ruling the country, with the best interest of the country in mind, ideally, okay? So, these are the basic, I told you there were 3 tripartite division. This is it. This is the tripartite division of the city. Now, of course, within the laborers, you're going to have different groups: doctors, farmers, carpenters, shipbuilders, whatever kinds of laboring you need. The guardians are going to be a smaller number of people, army and police, and then the rulers are the few. So I would like to actually draw, if you want, we could actually draw like a little sort of a pyramid here. Okay, meaning by this is just to sort of represent the proportion of the population. The rulers are going to be relatively small in number compared to the guardians, who are going to be, there's going to be more guardians than rulers, but the laborers are going to be the biggest class. Okay, so the largest class is actually on the lowest, so to speak, totem pole of the city, then the guardians, and then the rulers being on top. And again, on top meaning they're in control. They are in power, and they make rules for how these people should behave. They decide when the guardians should go to war. They decide what rules and regulations the laborers should follow. So that's going to be a picture of the ideal state, tripartite division of the state. Now, Plato goes ahead and says something here's the next very important step. And I'll try to write some of this on the board if I can. But for each class, there's going to be a virtue. Now remember the word virtue. A virtue is a good character trait of some sort. All right? A vice is a bad character trait. Now, Plato claims that for each of these classes, there's going to be a virtue that class should ideally excel at in order for the state to be an ideal state. Okay, so now what Plato does is, now remember I told you that the ancient Greeks believed in something called the 5 cardinal virtues. Which of those virtues would be the one, of all those virtues, which is the one virtue that the rulers need most of all? The answer is wisdom, okay? The virtue that the rulers need to excel at is wisdom. So let me just erase this here. The virtue that the rulers need to excel at is wisdom, because wisdom is, what actually is wisdom? Okay, do we have a definition of wisdom? So Plato comes along with a definition of wisdom, which is going to be somewhat incomplete, and we'll have to sort of go on in more detail about it maybe next time or the time after that. But basically, if you think about wisdom is some kind of knowledge, it's some kind of an intellectual virtue, right? To be wise is to have some kind of deep grasp or understanding of what is true and what is good. All right, to be a good leader, you have to understand what is good, and you have to also understand what is most importantly true about the world, but in particular about human beings, right? That's a certain kind of wisdom, a wisdom to know and understand people and how they act and why they do what they do. Human psychology, we might say today, okay? So wisdom is the virtue that the rulers need to have, and what is that going to be? That's going to consist in knowledge of the true, I'll just try to write that down here, knowledge of the true. I notice how I write knowledge of the true with a capital T. I'm doing that on purpose. Knowledge of the true and the good with a capital G. Okay, now I write knowledge of the true with a capital T because there's lots of truths that are not really that important for anybody to know, or maybe especially for a ruler to know. Okay, so for example, there's many truths that, like for example, how many threads are in the carpet that I'm looking down on the floor? Or what is the exact weight? What is the exact precise weight of this pen? Does it really matter? I don't know what the exact weight of this pen is, but would that make me a wise person if I knew what the exact weight of this pen was? No, because we tend to think, maybe we're mistaken, but we tend to think that knowing a fact like that is not really all that important for living a good life, right? So when we say knowledge of the true with a capital T, what we mean is knowledge of the most important truths about the world. Now, what those might be could be a matter of debate, and we're going to get into Plato's view about what is most importantly true. Not today, but probably the time after next, we'll see. Knowledge of the good with a capital G means deep understanding of what is truly the good. Ideally, understanding what is the definition, if we could get a hold of a definition of what is the true good, as opposed to sort of knowing things that, I know that it's good to give charity. I know that it's good to, I know that it's good to pay back your loans. Okay, so that's knowing an example of something that is good. But having knowledge or understanding of what the definition of goodness is, that would be true wisdom with a capital W. So if you might want to say, we're talking about wisdom in its most important sense would be knowledge of the true and the good, and also I included in knowledge of the true, knowledge of human nature, knowledge of why humans do what they do. What are humans looking for in life? Maybe a little knowledge about what makes human beings happy and fulfilled. Ideally, rulers would have that knowledge, and if they had that knowledge, then they would be able to govern the city in the ideal fashion, okay? So this is what Plato thinks about the virtue of the rulers. It is wisdom. Now let's move down to, I'm going to have to erase this. That doesn't mean you have to erase it from your notes. But let's, just to make some room here, let's talk about the guardians. The guardians, what they need most of all in terms of a virtue, out of the classic Greek virtues, is clearly going to be, you guessed it, courage, okay? The army needs to have courage. They need to have bravery because in addition to knowing how to shoot a gun, the virtue that they need to have is courage, okay? Now, what exactly is courage? Plato has a discussion of this, and what he says is that, a lot of people think that courage has to do with not being afraid of anything. We could call that fearlessness, okay? Some people think that that's what courage is. Courage is fearlessness, not being afraid. And Plato says that's not what true, genuine courage is. Because, for example, you could have a thief or a robber or a daredevil who's not afraid of getting caught, or they're not afraid of doing something really horrible and rash, okay? Imagine someone who says, well, I'm not afraid of jumping out of an airplane without a parachute because I'm not afraid of anything. That's just stupidity. That's what Plato says, okay? Plato says that fearlessness is not a virtue. So what exactly is the virtue of courage, okay? So it does have to do with fear, but it particularly has to do with controlling your fear and not letting it interfere with, no pun intended, not letting it interfere with doing what is right, doing what is good. So we're going to define courage as a willingness or a disposition to do what is right or good, even at the cost of suffering pain or possibly even death. All right? I'll say that again, so if you want to try to write that down, this is important. The definition of courage that we're supplying so far, we may have to refine it. There might be some tweaks we need to do to fix it up and make it good. But basically what we're saying now is that courage is a willingness, it's a disposition, it's a character trait, which if you have it, you're going to be willing to do what is right or good, even if it is scary, even if it costs you pain, even if it's going to make you suffer, even if, in some cases, even if it's going to cause your physical death. If you're willing to do what's good, stand up for what's right, even at the cost of suffering something, that is true courage. Okay? And of course, there's different kinds of suffering and pain. Sometimes suffering and pain can come in the form of people looking at you and abandoning you or making fun of you. Standing up for what's right, even in the face of challenges, that is true courage. Okay? Now, this is what the guardians need, because they're the ones who are going to risk their lives most of the time to do what is right and good to save the country or help the country. Now, where do the guardians, you might ask the following question, where do the guardians get their knowledge of what is good or right? Okay? How do they know what's good or right? Well, the guardians are going to have to rely on the rulers, which we said in the ideal state, let's put back the virtue here, that we're assuming that somehow the rulers have wisdom. The rulers have knowledge of the good. So the guardians are going to obey the rulers who have wisdom about what is good, and therefore they're going to be willing to do what is right or good, because that's what the rulers say. Now, of course, if the rulers lack wisdom, if the rulers don't have wisdom, then the guardians might end up doing things that are completely wrong, sacrificing their lives for no good reason. So the premise here is that the rulers are able to get wisdom, and we're going to have to come back to that. That's a very important point that we're going to have to come back to later on. The question of how do the rulers get wisdom? Where does this wisdom come from? How do they get knowledge of the true and the good? Okay, so we are going to come back to that, but right now we're just sort of laying out the scheme of the ideal city. In the ideal situation, the rulers would have wisdom, and the guardians would have courage because they would be obeying the rulers about when and how and where to risk their lives or suffer in order to do what is good or right. I do think we can add the following, though, is that you might ask the question, do the guardians need to have any wisdom whatsoever? The answer is yes. The guardians do need to have a little wisdom. They have to have enough wisdom to realize that these people really have wisdom. Okay? It's sort of like, you know, when you go to a doctor because you're sick, you don't necessarily know, what's wrong with you or what the cure is going to be, but you have enough wisdom to realize that you should go to a doctor, right? And you should trust what they have to say. Now, how they establish their credentials might be a good question. But if you know that someone, let's say, they went to medical school, they have a degree, they have a diploma, they study, they look like they're doctors, well, and they have patients walking in and out, so I guess they know what they're doing. Sometimes I wonder about that, but the point is, guardians do have to have a little bit of wisdom. They have to have enough wisdom to realize that they should listen to the rulers who really have wisdom. And again, how they get that wisdom is a question we'll have to come back to. Okay, so I hope you got down the definition of courage, a willingness or a disposition to do what is right, even at the cost of suffering, pain, discomfort, and possibly in some cases even death. That is true courage. That's what the guardians need. If they have it, things are going to go well for the city. Okay, finally, we move down to the laborers. Now, what is going to be the virtue of the laborers? They are not particularly wise. They are not particularly courageous. They might have a little bit of those virtues, but that's not what they excel at. What they really need to excel at is the virtue of temperance. Temperance is sometimes also called moderation. Moderation is also sometimes called self-control. Self-control means knowing your place and being obedient to that which is wiser and smarter and better than you. Okay? Allowing yourself to be controlled by those who really know what they're doing and those who are employing the will of the rulers. That is the virtue that Plato says the laborers need to have. they need to have, it's a kind of like a submission in a way. That's the way he's thinking of temperance. Submission is kind of the opposite of not going overboard, okay? Not saying, hey, I know what I'm doing, I can do whatever I want. Temperance has to do with a kind of, okay, I don't know necessarily what is the right thing to do, so I'm going to obey those who are wiser and smarter and stronger than me. Okay, so that is the virtue that the laborers have. Now, I think we could also throw in, there is really another virtue that, in a way, Plato would agree the laborers have to have, and actually, all of these groups need to have, but I think particularly he's going to say the laborers need to have, we're going to call this industriousness. Industriousness. Okay, I'm going to put that in brackets because he doesn't emphasize it as much, but I hope you can see that. It says industriousness. Now, industriousness is kind of the opposite of laziness, right? In order for the laborers to do what they need to do, they need to get up in the morning and go to work. If the laborers are lazy, then they're not going to be very good laborers, right? But that's really true also about the guardians. If the guardians are lazy and they're not, practicing their shooting or doing whatever soldiers need to do, then they're also not going to be very good soldiers. And the same thing is true for the rulers. So, in a way, industriousness is a kind of catch-all virtue that all of these groups need to have. Okay. I hope we're doing good so far. You might have some questions on this, and when we have our meeting when we have our in-person meetings, we can ask some questions and discuss this. But so far, you got it. The tripartite division of the city. Each part has a certain specific virtue that it is supposed to have. Again, in the ideal situation, those who are best suited to be laborers would end up being laborers. Those who are best suited to being guardians would end up being guardians, and those who are suited best to being rulers would end up being rulers, okay? But each of those groups would have to cultivate in particular the virtue that is special to that group, that's going to make the whole city function well overall. Okay, now we still haven't talked about justice. Where is the justice in the ideal city? We don't see justice here coming up. So actually, what Plato then says is that justice, kind of like what I said about industriousness, but justice is what he calls an overarching virtue. Justice is a virtue which applies to each part of the city, and it actually applies to the city as a whole. Where is the justice in the ideal city? So here comes Plato's definition of what it is for a city or a state to be just. And this may sound a little strange to you as a definition of justice, but this is what Plato says. Justice is found in a city when each part of the city or state is doing its proper task and not meddling in the affairs of the other parts of the city. I'll say that again. Justice for Plato occurs in a city. What is justice? Justice is a state or a status in a city when each part of the city or state is doing its proper task and not meddling, the word meddling as in interfering, okay? I think that's how you spell meddling. Okay, not meddling, I'm probably misspelling the word meddling. Not meddling, not interfering in the affairs of the other parts of the city. Now, for example, how can it occur? Plato goes on to give several examples of injustice in the city. Let's suppose the guardians who are best suited to engage in military combat and military defense of the city, let's suppose that the guardians somehow took over the rule of the city. Okay, they got rid of the rulers and they became the rulers. Well, if the guardians became the rulers of the city, that would be what Plato calls a corruption of the ideal state. The ideal state is not where the guardians are ruling, but where the guardians are guarding. Only the wise should rule. Now, if the guardians truly are wise, then they should be in the ruling camp, okay? They would be in a different group, okay? But we have a name for this in modern political philosophy or modern political science. There's a name for a kind of state where the soldiers or the military takes over the rule of a country, and it is called a military state, okay? A military state is, according to Plato, unjust because, again, the military has no business ruling the city. The military is supposed to remain military, and they're supposed to take their orders from the wise. When they take over the rulership of the state, that is a corruption, that's an unjust form of government. Okay? So again, the idea of a just city is one in which each part of the city is doing what it's supposed to do and not trying to do something that it shouldn't be doing given its nature. Okay, so a lot of this goes back to the idea that human beings by nature have a certain quality or task that they are best suited to do. And that's when they're going to be performing their in the ideal way. Okay, another corruption, another injustice would occur if the laborers took over the entire rulership of the country, right? If the laborers took over and started ruling, that would be a corruption because the laborers are not supposed to be ruling, they're supposed to be laboring. So some people might use the term socialism. Sometimes you might use the word communism, although that can mean other things as well, but the term is not so important for us. When you have the rule of the laboring class, according to Plato, that is a corrupt form of government, that's an unjust situation. Okay, another form of injustice, or another form of an unjust political structure is, guess what? According to Plato, democracy. Democracy, which we think, oh, democracy is really great. That's what we tend to think. According to Plato, democracy is a bad form of government. Now, let's try to understand why. Democracy means the rule of the people, right? The demos, right? The word democracy comes from the Greek word demos, which means the people or the masses. And theoretically, in a democracy, every individual gets to rule just as much as every other individual. In a true democracy, each and every person counts just as much as everybody else is in terms of their running the country. Okay, so what's going to happen in a democracy would be everybody, the rulers, the guardians, those who are wise, those who are not so wise, everybody gets an equal say in how to run the country. Plato says, what? That is bad. That's unjust. We don't want everybody having an equal say in how to run the country because, according to Plato, and this is part of what's driving this, again, only a relatively small number of people are going to have wisdom. You might say that Plato and Socrates were elitists, okay? Elitism, the idea of an elitist is somewhat at work here. I mean, I'm not saying that that's wrong or right. It's just a fact that, according to Socrates and Plato, most people, the run-of-the-mill people, have no business ruling because most people are not terribly wise. Wisdom is something that is found only among the few. They're going to be a little wise, but true, genuine wisdom is only something that's found among the few, very special people. Okay, we'll get into that a little more when we get into more depth on what is knowledge of the true and the good. Like I said before, though, we need to get into that. But getting back to what's wrong with democracy. According to Plato, most people have no business ruling. They should be laborers, they should be guardians, but they shouldn't be rulers. Okay? So therefore, democracy, which means everybody gets to rule equally, is a corrupt and unjust form of government. I'll give you one more example of an unjust form of government according to Plato. It's something which is sometimes called a plutocracy. Just gonna write that term on the board here in case you want to get it down. Plutocracy. A plutocracy is a government which is run or controlled, or a society in which those who have the most amount of wealth, so plutos in Greek means wealth or money. In a plutocracy, all decisions, all important decisions, the running of the government, the running of the state is made by people who have wealth. Now, Plato would say, plutocracy? Unjust, corrupt form of government. The only people who should be ruling are those who are wise. Doesn't matter, it shouldn't matter how much money they have or how much money they don't have. Money is a nice thing, but it is not, according to Plato, and I think this makes sense, right? Having money doesn't necessarily make you suited to be a ruler. Now, some might go on to say that in certain countries, I won't name any names, but in certain countries, unfortunately, what happens is that somehow, somewhere, it comes out that in order to be in government, you have to have a lot of money. The only way to get elected as a leader of a country is if you have a lot of money. Now, how that happened, why that happened, maybe it has to do with TV commercials, it has to do with publicity. Whatever the reason is, in certain countries, it becomes, unfortunately, the situation that having money is a quality which can actually get you into power in the government. And Plato would say there's something wrong with that. Right? That's an unjust system. It shouldn't be that way. What exactly is the cure for that is not so clear, but it's certainly not ideal that those who are wealthy should be ruling. Now, it could happen that someone happens to be both wealthy and wise, okay, that's fine, but then they're ruling not in virtue of their wealth, they're ruling in virtue of their wisdom. Okay, so we've talked about several corruptions of the ideal state. Just to quickly go over, we talked about if the guardians take over the rulership of the government, that's a military state. If the laborers take over the rule of the government, that's the rule of the laboring class. That's not good. That's unjust. If everybody takes equal control of the government, that's also bad. That's democracy. According to Plato, that's a corrupt form of government. Plutocracy. That's where people rule because of their wealth. That's also corrupt. Okay, now there may be other forms of corruption, but let's get back to what's good. The ideal state, the just society, is one in which each part of the state is doing its proper task, and as I said before, not meddling, not interfering, not trying to do something that it's not supposed to do. Now, when you have a just society, it's like having an organism or a machine in which each part is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, and then the whole thing is functioning the way it is supposed to. Then you have a society that is like a well-functioning organism, or a machine, if you will, okay? Like if you have a car, and the wheels are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and the steering wheel is doing what it's supposed to be doing, and all the various parts are interlocking in such a way that they do exactly what they're supposed to do, and the car is running along smoothly, then you have social justice and you have social well-being and social happiness, okay? A society overall is going to be in a good place if it is just, because each part's doing its proper task, not meddling in the affairs of others, and the whole thing as a whole is functioning well and properly. Okay, that's the ideal state for a society. The next thing we need to do, and I'm going to go on for a little bit here today, at least for another 15, 20 minutes, we're going to talk about the individual, okay? Because like I said before, now that we've outlined this picture of what it is for a state to be just and have virtue, right? Each of these are virtues. Overall, the whole thing is virtuous. Now we're going to talk about what it means for an individual to be just, for an individual to have virtue. Okay, so I'm going to erase this, but you can keep it handy because Plato claims that just as the city or the state ideally has these three parts, and justice has to do with each of them doing what they're supposed to be doing, so too it turns out that for the individual human being, the human soul has three parts. Very important point here. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about the idea of body and soul. Let's talk about that. Okay, Plato thinks that the human being is made up of a body and a soul. Now, in Greek, the word for soul is psyche, okay, from which we get our word psychology, psychiatry, psychosis. Literally, a psychiatrist is a doctor of the soul in Greek. Okay, so you have a body, that's your physical apparatus. You also have a soul. Now, exactly what the soul is a great philosophical question. And some people might even say, I'm not even sure I have a soul. What is a soul? Soul is some kind of mysterious entity. Maybe all I have is my body. Well, I think if we just take the word soul to mean psyche, it's surely the case that we have, in addition to physical parts, we have a psychological aspect to our nature, right? We think, we feel, we have certain emotions and desires. The psyche of the human being is clearly something that does exist in some way. Okay, no one's going to deny that they don't have a psychological life of some sort. Okay, now how the psyche relates to the body, and of course one of the big questions is, philosophers have pondered and argued about this for centuries. Can the soul exist without the body? Okay, now that's a good question. We're not going to discuss that today or maybe even next time, but it's clear that we have a body and a psyche in some sense. Okay, so when Plato talks about the soul, you can take him to be talking about the psyche, not necessarily something mysterious. Now, Plato himself and Socrates apparently did believe that there's a good chance that the soul does live on after the body dies. But whether or not the soul lives after the body dies is really a separate question from, do you have a soul? Do you have a psyche? Do you have feelings? Do you have emotions? Do you have thoughts? Do you have desires? Yes, of course you do. So in that sense, you have a soul / we can call it psyche or soul. Okay, so when it comes to the soul, Plato claims that the soul has three parts. The soul has three parts. And those three parts of the soul correspond to the three parts of the ideal state. So these are the three parts of the soul. You have reason. That's the rational part of the human being. You can think of reason or the intellect. Reason or the intellect, that is the mind, the ability to think, the ability to know, the ability to grasp concepts, ideas. Okay, I'll come back to courage later. You've got reason. You have something called spirit. And spirit is the capacity to have higher order emotions, such as fear, joy, exaltation, to get excited. When you get excited or happy or depressed, that's not something that's going on in your intellect. That's something that's going on in what Plato would call the spirit of a person. Okay, and then you have appetite. Appetite is sometimes called desire. Now, when Plato uses the word appetite, what he's thinking of is specifically is the drive that we have for pleasure and to avoid pain. Okay? But appetite could be, hunger is an appetite, thirst is an appetite. We want certain things. We have a desire for certain things. Generally, that which brings pleasure is what we desire, and that which brings pain or suffering or discomfort, we don't desire. Okay? So these are the three aspects or the three parts of the soul. And now Plato goes on to say that just as we said there were three virtues, and I still have them written up here, I am going to erase industriousness for now, because that might not apply so well, but for each of the three parts of the soul, there's going to be a virtue that is associated with that part. Obviously, what is the virtue that's associated with the intellect? It's going to be wisdom. The intellect is going to be the part of us that knows anything. So a good, virtuous intellect would be an intellect that has knowledge of what is true and good. So you can write down, remember that definition of wisdom I had before, knowledge of the true and the good. Well, that's what it means for an individual human being to have the virtue of wisdom. It's the same definition as what we said before for the rulers. So reason corresponds to the rulers and has the virtue of wisdom. If it has the proper virtue that it should have, it's going to have wisdom, knowledge of the true and the good. Spirit needs to have courage. What does that mean? Again, it means basically the same thing. It's the spirit of a person that is going to carry them through to do what is right or good, even at the cost of suffering. To have that sense of bravery and courage, to be willing to put yourself out on the line, to do what is right or good, that is courage. And that's a virtue that's going to apply to the spirit, because the intellect has wisdom, but the intellect doesn't get afraid of anything. It's the spirit of a person. It's the emotional aspect of a person that sometimes gets scared and frightened. And having the ability to control that emotion, that's going to be something that spirit does under the direction of reason. Okay, so according to Plato, reason is supposed to be in control because reason has wisdom. So the rational part of the soul is going to sort of tell the spirit what it should and should not be either afraid of, or if it is afraid of certain things, to control and tamper down that fear so it can do what is right or good, even at the cost of suffering or death. Okay, and finally, what is the virtue which is unique, especially to the appetite? It's going to be temperance, submission. The thing about the appetites is that the appetites seek, they want to have pleasure, they want to avoid pain. And a person's going to have temperance if they're willing to submit or allow that desire to be controlled by reason. Okay, so you see the parallel with the virtue of the laboring class when it comes to the city, right? We said that for the city, the laborers need to have temperance, that is to say, self-control, submit to the rulers. It's the same thing for the individual soul. The individual soul is going to have temperance when he or she submits his or her desires to reason, allowing oneself to be controlled by those who are wiser, in this case, one's own rational capacity to know what is good. Allowing oneself to be controlled by that is what it means for an individual to have temperance. And finally, what about justice? Well, Remember what we said, justice for the ideal city is when each part of the city is doing its proper task and not meddling in the affairs of the other parts, then you have a just city. So similarly, when each part of the soul is doing its proper task and not meddling, not interfering in the affairs or the job of the other parts, then you have a just human being. So it's the same definition, except instead of talking about the parts of the city, we're talking about the parts of the soul. So I'll say it one more time, I'll probably say it more than one more time. A just soul, a human being has a just soul when each part of his or her or their soul is doing what it's supposed to be doing, when reason is ruling with wisdom, when spirit is enforcing the dictates of reason over appetite by having courage, and when desire is humbly submitting to the rule of reason, then you have a temperate appetite, you have a courageous spirit, you have a wise intellect, then you have overall a just human being. So justice is again what we call an overarching virtue. When each part of the soul is doing its proper task, then you have a just person, and it's like that well-oiled machine. It's like that organism where each part is doing what it's supposed to be doing and everything is flowing smoothly and properly. That's when you have a just human being. Okay, now you may have a lot of questions about this. There may be some things that are not so clear or things that I've kind of rushed over, but we need to get to something really important now, and that is, as I said, Plato uses this theory, or Socrates, the character in the dialogue, uses this theory to now answer the Glaucon ring argument. And he does it in the following way. He says that there is, just as we can speak about the health of the body, remember we talked before about body and soul, right? We said that according to Plato, there's body and there's soul. Now, we can talk about the health of the body, and we said, if you remember, I think I gave you as an example of something that Plato regards as something that is desirable for its own sake and for its consequences, is health. We all want to be healthy because we want to be healthy. Health is good for us. And in addition to that, if we're healthy, we can then go out and do other things that we enjoy. Like if I'm healthy, I can then go and, let's say, play basketball, or I can go out for dinner because I'm feeling healthy. If I'm sick, I can't go out for dinner because I have to stay home. So health is something that we desire for its own sake as well as its consequences. Now, here's what Plato says. In addition to bodily health, we can also speak about psychic health, or the health of the soul. Okay? What is psychic health? It's justice. That's exactly what psychic health is. Psychic health is justice. What did we say justice was for the individual soul? When each part of the soul is doing its proper task, then you have an overall functioning, well-constructed soul that's doing, each part is doing what it's supposed to be doing and not doing things that are bad or wrong for it. Then you have psychic health. Then you have justice in the soul. Now, given that justice is psychic health, it now turns out that everybody should, once they understand what justice truly is, everyone should want to be just for its own sake, as well as for its consequences. Because just as we want bodily health, we also want psychic health. Who does not want to be healthy? Nobody in their right mind would want to be sick and diseased, right? So, therefore, since justice is the same thing as psychic health, it follows that justice is something that we should pursue for its own sake, as well as for its consequences. Those people who don't understand this and think that, they don't realize that they're messing up their soul, essentially. They're living with a sick soul if they are unjust. Okay, so they don't realize it. They're going to be actually not so happy. But true happiness consists in psychic health, which is justice. Therefore, everybody should want to be just for its own sake. If only people understood and grasped this, that's what they would want to do. And that is Plato's answer to the ring argument. Now, there's a lot to talk about here. There's some criticisms, there's some questions, there's some problems. I'm not going to get into that right now. What I am going to talk about just very briefly for the next few minutes is, remember how we talked about in the case of the city or the state, there are several possible corruptions that could occur. So let's just talk about a few corruptions that can occur within the individual person. Corruptions of the individual soul, which would make the person unjust and therefore, according to Socrates, unhealthy and therefore unhappy. Okay, so very quickly here, remember how we talked about sometimes the guardians can take over the rulership of the state. That would be a military state, that would be bad, that would be a corruption. Well, in some people, the spirit takes over the control of the person. They are ruled by their emotions. They're ruled by spirit. Plato would say, bad, bad, bad news. You want to be ruled by your own rational capacities. The intellect is supposed to be in charge. Reason, reason, reason. Because reason, according to Plato, is capable of knowing what is good. And again, we're going to have to get back to that because that's the question. How does reason know what's good? But assuming that reason can somehow have wisdom and know what is true and good, it should be in control. Spirit should listen to reason and not try to take over. So when you have spirit taking over reason in a person's life, that's bad news. When you have appetite taking over and ruling over reason, you know what that's called? That's called hedonism. Remember we talked about hedonism last time? Hedonism or ethical hedonism is the view that pleasure is the good. Well, if someone is ruled by pleasure, whether it's the pleasure of the moment or whether it's long-term overall pleasure over the course of one's life. Remember, we made that distinction between short-term hedonism and long-term hedonism, right? Whether a person is ruled by, whether a person is after long-term pleasure or short-term pleasure, if all they're after ultimately is pleasure, then what you have here is someone who is ruled by their appetites. They become appetitive types, just like the corruption of the state when the laborers take over the state, that's a corruption. The point of life is not to pursue pleasure, the point of life is to pursue the good and to be good, which is not the same thing as pleasure. What exactly is Plato's theory of the good? Again and again I say, we need to get to that later on, okay? But it would be a corruption to be a hedonist because then you would be ruled by your appetites when you should be ruled by reason. Okay? And then you have something which Plato calls the democratic man. The democratic man or democratic person is someone who they treat all these three things equally. Sometimes they're ruled by reason, sometimes they're ruled by spirit, sometimes they're ruled by desire. Everybody gets an equal say. Again, Plato would say that's wrong. That's like a democracy. That is a corruption of the ideal. You should always be strictly ruled by reason. Reason is in charge. Reason knows what it's doing. It should be the leader. It should dominate over spirit, and spirit should dominate over appetite. When you have any of those forms of injustice, you end up having a corrupt soul that is not a healthy soul, and no one wants to live life with a corrupt soul, and so therefore, justice is something which is desirable for its own sake. And even if you had a ring that made you invisible, like that guy Gyges did, you should still want to do what's just to preserve the health of your soul. So that is Plato's answer to the ring problem. We talked about some possible corruptions. I do want to throw a term at you. You may have heard this before. I don't think I said this in this class before, but Plato is known as a rationalist. He believes in something called rationalism. He doesn't use this term, but this is a term that is used to describe Plato's view. And for our purposes in this class, we're saying that Plato believes in rationalism. He is a rationalist. What does it mean to be a rationalist in this context? Basically, Plato is someone who thinks that reason is very powerful. Reason has the ability to know what is true and good, and reason should always be in charge. All the other faculties, all the other powers that we have, spirit, appetite, the body, everything should be ruled by reason, okay? Because reason knows what's good, or can know what's good, know what's true, and with that knowledge, the human being can live a good, happy, healthy life. So that's rationalism, and of course there are many philosophers we'll see later on. Just to name one, we're going to talk eventually about a man named David Hume, H-U-M-E. I think I mentioned his name the first day of class. David Hume was not a rationalist. He believed that human beings are primarily emotional creatures, that our emotions and our desires are really what makes us do what we do, and reason is really only, so to speak, a slave to the emotions. So you have different views, different philosophers. Plato is a rationalist. Reason should be in charge. If reason is in charge, you're going to end up with a just, healthy, happy soul. And again, as I say, that is Plato's answer to the ring argument or the ring problem. Okay, it was a lot for today. I think we're going to call it to a close for today. We still are going to be working with Plato for at least 1 or 2 more sessions. Be on the lookout for an email from me which will give you a link to a live Microsoft Teams conversation that should be coming to you in the near future. If you have any questions, you have any thoughts, you have any comments you want to share, please feel free to email and or call me as usual. But otherwise, I'll see you next time. Have a good day.